Hi, my name is Paul Gerard, and I'm here to answer some questions today. Thank you for joining us. This afternoon, we're running this kind of session. Let me just change the slide. We're running this session as a different kind of webinar, if you like. Rather than try and present you, the bald facts and trying to give you a sales presentation a lot of the time, or to explain or introduce some specific concept or idea. We want to try and answer questions that are from the floor, if you like. Now, this is the first time we've run it, and so we asked you to just ask a question as you registered, and we've got some. But I'm hoping that if we have time, certainly, that if you register a question through the webinar software, there might be a few we could pick up at the end of the slot. So it's a rather experimental, but I hope the questions are kind of interesting. They were certainly interesting from our point of view, and we've probably elaborated them a little bit just to make it a little bit more rounded. Quite often questions can be either very focused and too technical, and it's almost like the answer is a yes or a no. That's not ever quite true, but in order to give you a slightly more rounded vision of where we come from and what our view of the world is, the testing world is, we've tried to expand on the question and illustrate with maybe an example, or maybe with stories, or through our own experience, how we would address a problem that perhaps you've got. We also hope to make this a regular event. It's probably something we might run once a month, but we'll see how it goes today. We'll see how the feedback goes, and take it from there. Now, before I start, just the usual disclaimer. I mean, some of these are not off-the-cuff answers, but they are our personal views. It's the way we think in the company, and if you find them useful, well, that's great. That's fantastic. But our recommendation is that you have to go away and still think your way through your own problems. All we're trying to do is give you some ideas. Not everything we say is appropriate in every situation, of course, so be a little bit careful with what we say. Or just give us a call. Heavens, I mean, our business is consulting, so do get in touch if you need some assistance. Okay, enough of that. Let's go. So here are the prepared questions, and I'm just going to crash through them. And I think I'll have 8 lined up, so I'm going to go through them and then maybe pick up some questions from the floor, if you like, afterwards. So here's a nice open question. How does testing fit into an agile environment? I have to say, this has been the subject of several books. So to answer that as a question in a webinar is a bit of a challenge. But let me give you the 5-minute kind of potted history, if you like, the potted answer. I mean, first let me explore for a second what an agile environment is. I mean, the whole world seems to be going agile nowadays, and it's not something that's negotiable. Even companies who would never have regarded themselves as agile, the bigger corporations, the banks and insurance and the whole manufacturing industry, and obviously everything that's online, everything seems to be going down this direction of agile. So this juggernaut is headed your way, and the challenge is, well, what do you do? Where do you fit if you're the tester in a structured or a waterfall environment? Well, agile is characterized in kind of 2 ways, a lot more than this, of course. But firstly, it's a multidisciplined team. That is, the team is self-organizing. It has the skills within it in order to deliver some software of values. It has business knowledge from your product owner. There's perhaps a business analyst in the team, obviously developers, if you're lucky, a tester or 2 as well. Okay, so it's a multidisciplinary team tasked with delivering some software of value that has control of its own destiny. So it decides how it will behave and how it will operate. It will manage its own process, if you like. Now, one of the part of the deal is that the quality and the testing, obviously, is everyone's responsibility. That is, the whole team share responsibility for the definition and the assurance of the product to be delivered. Now, you could say that what the tester's role is it's not testing, it is more what we would call assurance. And in an agile team of 5, 6, 7, 8 people, it's clearly assurance in the small. So let me summarize what assurance is. The tester is accountable for the testing done by the team. So you're kind of responsible for the quality of the work, the testing work, but you're not going to be doing it all yourself. You can't. Okay, so you can't do the developer testing on behalf of the developers. You can't do all the user testing on behalf of the users. Now you might be asked to do some or part of these things, but I think your role is to step back a little bit at one level and survey the need for testing, and then to help the team figure out the best way of implementing it. Now there are two aspects really that I want to talk about a little bit. Is in that the tester really has to take a slightly skeptical view of almost everything. Okay, so you become, as is traditional in all projects, the tester is the conscience of the team, if you like. So you ask questions all the damn time. It's irritating, but it's responsible. So what I'm suggesting is that when people believe they've reached a conclusion, that your role as a tester is to challenge that and to say, well, do we have enough information to say the requirement is ready? Do we understand the requirement? Do we understand enough to estimate the work in our planning meetings? Do we know enough to develop, to create the software or to test it? I would say that is the requirement trusted? That is, do we trust the requirement to be stable and understood well enough in order to be confident that we can build some software of value? Clearly, we take a view on what the risks of the development activity itself is, and we take a view on whether these are the risks to the business or that they are caused by the development activity or the approach we have. You know, are the developers biting off more than they can chew? These are the questions we need to ask. What testing can and will the developers do? This is quite important. So the developers might be coming from a structured environment and presume that their unit testing, and they are maybe used to not doing unit testing of any great depth. But Agile teams depend very much on the developers taking ownership of their own development testing and not relying on later system testers, because there is in effect no system test team looking to provide a safety net. So, but what testing can the developers do? If they're not, if they don't have the skills or the tools to do unit testing in a more sophisticated way, can the project team deliver what it needs to deliver? What system level or acceptance testing will be done? Who will do that? Again, the tester has to figure out whether it's the tester themselves, or whether they bring in the users to assist, and in fact whether the users are the best people to do the testing. Okay, so the tester needs to ask these difficult questions. I've put a little image of the tester's pocketbook just to remind me that the pocketbook itself, if you Google tester's pocketbook, it's a small book with some proposals for axioms of testing, if you like. And really the purpose of the axioms is to focus your attention on 16 critical issues, and it gives you a selection of questions to ask. So these are as appropriate in an Agile context as they are in a waterfall or structured project. So what's the tester's contribution to the testing itself? Well, I've put 5 suggestions, regarding feature or story acceptance criteria or scenarios. There's the developer unit testing, which might be or should be automated. There's a notion of story acceptance test, and service or user interface level automation, and so on. I've put blanks there because the challenge for the tester is to figure out what their contribution is. Because at one level, it might be very sensible for the tester to write the story acceptance criteria. Or it might be a better approach, if there's a business analyst in the team, to simply support the BA when they create the acceptance criteria. It depends on the composition of your team. And one of the critical values of Agile is that the team has to decide whether and how it performs activities and when it's got the skills available and who should provide those skills and conduct that activity. So really the tester needs to figure out what his contribution is and to negotiate with other members of the team as to what they do. Now the scope of your consideration as a tester is from the lowest level of detail, I suggest, to what developers do, through to system integration. So when you hand over the output of your project team, of your Agile project, to perhaps a bigger program of work where your system has to be integrated with other systems, the scope of what you have to consider is from that lowest level of detail also to look outside the project into the integration aspect later on. So potentially you'll be liaising with integration testers who'll be taking the software from you and to integrate into a bigger system overall. But the idea would be that you've got to figure out what the requirement is yourself, fill in the blanks yourself, and negotiate with your team. So in summary, the way I'd suggest you work on this is to make a list of the activities that you think you can contribute to the team, and for each one of them set out the benefits. It may be the developers assume they do the unit testing and they don't have any input from yourself, but perhaps you could contribute to that. So one thing you might do is you might pair with the developers to do their unit testing. The potential is there to really get stuck in and work very closely down and dirty with the developers. It might also be that you simply act as a coach to the developers, to give them some guidelines, to give them some assistance, if you like, in the creation of tests, but not running the tests, not actually getting down and dirty, if you like. When you make a list of the things you could do, consider how long it will take, what you can contribute in terms of your effort. Because one outcome could be that you volunteer to do all these things and everybody dumps responsibility for testing on you. You have to resist that and only do what you can sensibly contribute. The offer you make to your team and negotiate is, it should be prioritized. You need to place more attention yourself on the upfront questioning rather than getting your hands dirty, banging away at tests at the end. It's much better to challenge the requirements than to test software which is misguided. So focus your attention as early as you can, if you can. Push the test automation effort down to the developers. The developers are in the best position to capture automated software tests to prevent regression through change. Support the developers and perhaps your user testers, if you can bring them into the team, rather than owning the testing yourself. So don't be the go-to person for questions on testing, but not the test activity itself. If you can, act as a coach to the other members of the team in their testing. Now, clearly, there will be a demand on your time to do some hands-on stuff. And of course, you can't say no because you are a team and you all have to contribute. But if you like, you need to sort of step back a little bit and say, well, you have a role as a coach and a kind of a conscience and a policeman almost within the context of the team, as well as being a hands-on tester. We use the term test master. I mean, I'm sure you've all heard of Scrum Masters. I have a rather jaundiced view of what Scrum Masters can offer to a team. They're kind of coaches across the piece, perhaps, but I think people know enough to know how Agile teams work. A test master is really kind of a much more close to the metal kind of coach, helping stakeholders, product owners to understand their requirements better, helping developers to understand how to put tests together and to run tests and interpret tests and to achieve some form of coverage, and the users who come in and will do the acceptance itself. So a test master is kind of the label we put on an Agile tester's role. One little aside, again, you might find this useful. If we've written a method called DefoSpan, which is free to use, and you can access the content and the method itself online. If you look up DefoSpan through Google, you'll see a link to a couple of pages which outline a method for identifying features and acceptance criteria from requirements. So to help you with the requirements validation and also the use of those stories through to automated testing, acceptance testing later. And it's all part of the Business Story Pocketbook. I'll give you a link at the end of the session where you can download, or if you choose to, buy a hard copy. The download is free, I should say. So another question. Now, this one I've slightly reworded a little bit, but to shorten it. But how do you get into software testing without experience? Well, that's an interesting one, because an awful lot of people have got into software testing without experience historically. But I think it's getting harder, and I think there's great pressure to reduce the number of inexperienced or less capable testers in the business. That's another kind of debate, which I'm not going to go into today, but I think there is great pressure economically to reduce the cost of testing. So the testers who will survive and the testers who will make progress in getting jobs, I think, are going to be the experienced, more capable ones. So on the one hand, how do you get any job without experience? It's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, I can't promise any miracles here, of course. But let me say this. Overall, and simplistically, but overall, you need three broad skills areas to test systems and software. The first one is domain knowledge, knowing what the purpose of the software is, what the users are trying to achieve with this product. Now, you might not have that detailed knowledge, but you must know how to get it. So maybe you need almost business analysis skills to understand how to communicate with end users, stakeholders, product owners, to derive the knowledge required to understand how a piece of software should work, and to interpret how you can derive meaningful tests. Now, the testing skills themselves are kind of generic across all business domains, but essentially the testing skills are those you'd recognize as test analysis. It's understanding, from the source of knowledge what the software should do, and then how to demonstrate that the system achieves it, but also obviously the bug detective kind of skill, looking for problems, exploring and theorizing on what could go wrong, and then creating experiments, if you like, to see whether it does go wrong in the ways that you can imagine. So the testing skills obviously are always required. The technical skills, again, if you're an end user, technical skills aren't so relevant. But if you are a system tester or an integration tester, you may have to use technology to support the work you do. So technical skills are kind of the third leg of the skill set for testing. Now, depending on the role you go for, the proportions of each, the domain knowledge, the testing skills, the technical skills, the proportions vary with the role. So a user tester doesn't need many tech skills, of course, but a developer tester might need a developer or an integration tester. Their whole job might be dominated by the use of technology to implement tests and to run them at speed and in volume, perhaps. So technology is core to that. Now, a developer might not need so much domain knowledge, but it can only help, if that makes sense. It might not be a necessary skill, but my goodness, it's helpful at times. So let me just move on to say, well, wait a minute, what are the routes into testing? Now, there's probably an infinite number, but these are the ones that we've seen people follow historically. One very common route in business organizations that use software is their user community very often are, I'm tempted to say hijacked, but are seconded to acceptance test teams. An awful lot of people I've met over the years, and quite a few test managers as well, people who lead substantial teams, started their careers in the business, whether it was in banking or insurance or manufacturing or defense or whatever. An awful lot of people have followed that route. So they didn't start their career as a tester, but they've gone from the business through to the IT department maybe, and the testing route. Another route, an obvious one, is from a development team to a system test team, where you bring your technical skills. A lot of developers love what they do and could do it endlessly to the day they die. But quite a few developers actually tire of writing software and actually find the challenge of testing much more interesting. So quite a few testers out there came from a development team background. Now, another common route is from help desk or technical support. So the people who support either users or technical support roles get to know very well how users want the software and the systems to work, and will know from a technical perspective the way that software can be configured and what the workarounds are, and they'll know in very great detail. There's a very easy transition from help desk to technical support to a test team. Some of the best testers around have come from that background. Now, those are the three common kind of routes, and there's probably others, I'm sure. But unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, some testers are basically pushed out of one role in their organization and told, go and join the test team, almost with a view that anyone can do this. And it's kind of, you could be lucky or unlucky as to what the attitude to testing is within your organization. But sometimes the move to testing is not it's not your choice. And there's a lot of people who find that actually they do find their niche once this has happened. But that's another route, clearly. Now, if you don't have experience, well, how do you get into testing? Well, potentially you could come through one of those routes. So maybe you join a business acceptance team, or you maybe join as a business person with an interest in testing. And given that testing isn't always as popular as it could be, you might stand out in that regard. Or maybe you become a developer and then work through that route, or maybe you start working on a help desk or providing technical support. These are potentially stepping stones. The challenge we have is if you don't have experience, if the job that you acquire that might ask or demand no experience, this might betray a lack of regard for testing in that organization. So if you like, the more difficult it is to become a tester, the more highly regarded you would expect those testers to be within the organization. So you have to be careful. A job that's acquired without experience may not be a great job. But let me, just as an aside, talk about how much experience is enough. Well, I tell a story about 6-month-old babies. A 6-month-old baby, when you give it a toy brick or a rattle or a dummy even, what do? They will hold it in their hands, but pretty quickly they will put it in their mouths. They test it. They taste it. So testing is something that isn't something we only begin to understand when we're adults. It's part of our lives. Almost everything we experience, everything we choose in life, there is some form of testing associated with it. Whenever we make a purchase, there is some psychological challenge going on in our mind about whether this is the right thing to buy or to use. So my argument is that I've been testing for more than 50 years, and I think that every human being, with a modicum of intelligence has done too. So as a person who has hired testers over the years, experience is fantastic, but it isn't everything. And sometimes it's much more interesting to have a conversation with people and see how they think. And when you have the conversation, the challenge is, does this person in front of me, do they ask good questions? Are they satisfied with a simple answer, or do they probe and ask follow-up questions? Can you see in their eyes that they're thinking and considering what they're being told and saying, well, wait a minute, that's not exactly correct, or there's a variation, or what if? Can you see a systematic approach in their questioning? Can they put a theory to you and then suggest some tests which will challenge that theory? So can they posit a mode of failure and then create tests to demonstrate that mode of failure will or won't happen? When they join your team, can you imagine whether they will need an awful lot of support and hand-holding? Or are they rather independent? They like to work. They don't need constant supervision in order to get working. Now, these aren't questions of experience. They're questions of personality and kind of confidence in some respects. can the people we interview, now can you, when you are interviewed, if someone says, test this system, do you need to spend months thinking about it and having lots of information in front of you, or can you simply get your hands on it and then just go for it? Now, I'm not saying either of those approaches is right or wrong, but the context of the organization that you wish to join, know how it works for them. So a question you must ask them is, well, am I going to be handed mountains of documentation to work through, or am I just going to be given a half-hour conversation with the user and then told, go and test this feature of the system? Be prepared to ask good questions and to demonstrate your thinking capability. Experience is important, but the way you think, in my experience, is more important than experience, if that makes sense. So following with that, from that, and an interesting question which is kind of topical, it's always topical, is this notion of, do you need a testing certification, a certificate on the wall in order to get a testing job? Now, whether you think it's right or wrong, let's just explore whether it's a meaningful question. Well, I have to say, if you see a job description, it says mandatory requirement, ISTQB foundation course in software testing, foundation certificate in software testing. Well, it probably is mandatory, and they probably will challenge you or reject your CV if you don't have it. Now, but the thing to think about is, if you haven't got the certificate, it might be that you simply haven't got around to doing it, or it might be that you are very against tester certification, and both positions are perfectly valid. The challenge you have is, well, wait a minute, if the certification requirement is used as a filter to simplify the agent's job, the agency who are doing the recruitment on behalf of their client, if it's there to simplify their job, pick up the phone and ask them that question. Is it there simply to filter out, to reduce the number of CVs? Now, the challenge you have is, if that's the case, or if that's the case even for the client simply is overwhelmed with applications for the job, if the certification is there simply to filter it out and reduce the number of CVs or resumes that they have to consider, try and engage them in a conversation about what your skills really are. Because the certification, it has a function. I'm not going to go into the pros and cons of certification. It has a purpose. It has a goal. But if what the client is actually looking for are a very particular set of skills, and you have them, the certification is going to limit the number of skilled and qualified candidates for the role. Now, if you can make that connection and make that argument, perhaps the sort of certification requirement will go away. But you have to make a case. You can't just say, I don't believe in certificates. I mean, that you'll just be dismissed out of hand. You've got to put something in its place. You've got to say what your skills are and why you believe that your skills are actually above and beyond what the certification could have demonstrated. Now, this was an odd one. Who represents the testing community? I didn't know how to take this one. It wasn't quite worded this way, but it's one of my own little hobby horses, and I'm choosing to elaborate, I think, the question that was asked. Who represents the testing community? Who are our leaders? And I've got this as a talk coming up at Eurostar in November in Gothenburg, Sweden, but that's by the by. Perhaps the question to ask is, who represents you and your interests? So the testing community that are out there, this body of people who are in the testing business, let's say, or whose business is testing, who represents you and your interests? Now, the choices and the options out there that we could consider are pretty varied, and it's kind of scary in one respect. I mean, we have the certification bodies. Now, do they represent us? The standards bodies, IEEE, ISO, and so on, do they represent us? Is it the testing conferences and forums? Is it a school? I mean, the context-driven school make a good case for representing their members, but that's not the industry. That's a subset, let's say. How about the guys who write books? The thought leaders and the bloggers out there who are putting out content to inform and to educate, and clearly to lead and perhaps do business too? Or is it the conferences and the conference speakers, the trainers and the coaches who work in that kind of network? Do they represent the community? Or is it the testing consultants, the service companies? I mean, these are the people whose business it is to do this job. Or is it, after all said and done, it's actually the big businesses, the huge corporations who offer system integration companies? Potentially, they employ the most testers on the planet. Do they represent the community? This is one of the problems I think we have as an industry, is that we don't have a particular focus. Now, it may be that we don't need a particular focus, and actually we are incredibly lucky to have such a diverse set of potential leaders pulling in sometimes the same, sometimes different directions. It's a very rich source of knowledge, to know that these things are out there. But who is the community? Well, let me tell you a story about this. Some years ago, I think maybe 10, I had a conversation with the CEO of one of the big testing services company, and we were talking about this and that, and he asked me very particularly, how many testers did I think were in the UK? And I'd thought about this, coincidentally, a few weeks earlier, and I came up with a number of 50,000. And this wasn't too far away from the number 45,000 that he suggested that perhaps were out there. It kind of made me smile, because I kind of knew that he'd paid for that number and I had guessed, and I wasn't so far off. But that's by the by. But then the discussion turned to, well, suppose we all put our address books together and made a list of all the testers we all know in our networks. Interestingly, because I personally spend time doing a conference network and we do training and we have our own clients, other companies operate in a similar way. They have their we reckon that actually only about between 5,000 and 10,000 people would be on all our mailing lists, if you like, across the UK. We thought we didn't actually make contact with more than 5 or 10% of the people in testing in the UK. Now, I think that number's increased, and my guess is now we've probably doubled that. Maybe we do 20%. But even so, for people like me who network in a certain way, the people I know is a small fragment of the whole testing community. So how can I say, from my personal point of view, how can I say I represent anybody in the testing community? I just don't know who these guys are. Now, the other thing is a story would be I was at Star East in 2007 in Orlando, and there was a post-conference kind of ad hoc kind of panel session, and there was a comment made by one of the people there, and there were about 1,000, maybe 1,200, I don't know exactly, but over 1,000 people at the Star conference. And someone said, who I won't name, we represent the testing industry. And I said, well, I had to stand up and say, no, I'm going to have to challenge that, because right next door there are 25,000 people at the SAP conference. Now, SAP is a single product. It's a massive industry in its own right. But there are probably 5,000 to 10,000 testers in the conference next door. I don't think we were representing the industry at all. So my challenge is this, is that don't think of someone as an industry leader. You can only put yourself in one community and regard that community as your sphere of influence, or your sphere, your network, if you like. But there is a huge community of testers who you might never meet. For example, the SAP guys kind of operate as an industry within an industry, and there's not an awful lot of exchange between the testers in SAP projects and everyone else, for example. So I'm very skeptical about people promoting themselves as leaders. Leaders are elected, not self-elected, if you like. They're elected by their community. But the communities that we operate in is very fragmented, and I'm very suspicious of people who try and classify me as being in a school. I just don't think that way. I'm very skeptical about people representing me as well. Maybe that's me, but I just think that we need to think a bit more carefully about what it means to be part of a testing community and to be a leader or a representative of that community. So just as a bit of background, we host the Test Management Forum in the UK, and my suggestion is to find the networking events in your country, in your region, in your discipline. So we host the TMF in the UK and a LinkedIn group. In the UK, we have the British Computer Society Specialist Interest Group in Software Testing, which has been going for 20 years, I guess. But increasingly, we see these regional and local tester gatherings and meetups right around the country. Online, there's a Software Testing Club, which is organizing events as well, and training, and it's a commercial arrangement as well, as being an online community. And then there are LinkedIn groups all over the place. Track down the communities that you think you want to be a member of and treat that as your world. The testing community overall across all the planet is much bigger than any of us will ever be able to explore. Okay, number 5. An automation question. Had to happen, didn't it? And I've kind of paraphrased this a little bit, but all our test automation is at the end and it's unmanageable. How do we reduce the work and speed up test execution? I think the challenge is I'm pretty certain, the scale of the regression test that's automated and rerun at the end of every project delivery, or towards the end of each project delivery, is so cumbersome that it's now becoming a significant drain and delay on project and enhancement work. So we had a client with this question a little while ago, and this was exactly the challenge. And how do we reduce the amount of tests that we have to maintain because we're not certain of its value, and it causes a lot of grief, it's very expensive, and we're now getting blamed for the delay in delivery. Now, a lot of people have experienced problems with late test automation, typically end-to-end test automation, and don't want the same mess again in their next project. So it's those people I'm addressing this answer, if you like. But also companies who've got themselves into this pickle and need a regression solution, anti-regression solution, but the one they've got isn't satisfactory. Let me just step back and just make one statement about how people get into this kind of mess. Usually it's because system test teams have taken the approach of they've taken their manually performed end-to-end tests and simply, or with great difficulty, migrated that to an automated end-to-end test. When you take your manual tests and automate them, expect trouble. It's ferociously expensive, doesn't always work, and the value of what you've got when you've done this is possibly marginal. It might not have value at all. So let me just introduce some ideas. I'm not going. This is a big question. Okay, it's again there are books which have attempted to answer this, but I want to mention Brian Marrick's testing quadrants as a way of thinking about where the automation sits in the way that you do your testing. And I'm not going to spend much time on this except to consider working left to right. On the left-hand side, we have tests that support the team. That is, they help the team to deliver, and the tests on the right critique the product. You know, they verify that things work the way they should. And then running north-south, up and down, you can see tests that at the top are business-facing, user tests through the user interface, and at the bottom we've got technology-facing. That is, that probably the unit tests, and they're code-oriented. They're technically oriented. The bottom right we have the non-functional stuff. The top right we have the user acceptance, usability stuff. Top left we have functional tests, feature tests, storyboard-based testing, and bottom left we have in effect the developer testing, unit and component level testing. This is one way of thinking about where you put your automation, and the little clouds in the four corners suggest where tools and automation are appropriate. Now, another way of looking at this, and there are several versions of this test automation pyramid. If you Google it, you'll see 4 or 5 different flavors of this, all with slightly different explanations, but the principles are the same. The pyramid reflects the relative number of tests and the level at which they operate. So the majority of automated tests should be at the level of unit or components. That is, they are developer tests. So the bulk of your regression test automation should be against units and components. Now, the intermediate layer, what's been called acceptance tests or the API layer or service level, potentially, these might be tests which are driven with automation, but they access services rather than the user interface. The user interface tests at the top, the GUI tests, the automated ones are, in effect, end-to-end, demonstrating business processes in action, scenarios through business processes. And at the top, we've got this little cloud, which is manual tests. And it's almost, the implication is manual testing should be a small minority of all the tests. Well, the potential is there now, through agile teams in particular, to reduce the amount of manual testing quite considerably. Of course, manual testing will never be eliminated, never. But the move of the industry and the development community in particular is towards something called continuous delivery. And essentially, most of the testing, or checking, perhaps I should call it that, is actually done by tools. Perhaps manual checking will become the exception. Now, our argument with this is that testing has to be redistributed. The effort of testers needs to be moved upstream into identifying good acceptance criteria and scenarios and using those to validate the knowledge, the requirements knowledge. If there's a requirements document or a statement, perhaps these scenarios can challenge those. So we use these scenarios to challenge the source of knowledge for the requirement first. But once they're trusted, they can be used to drive what's nowadays called acceptance test-driven or behavior-driven, or the more normal test-driven development process. So we can use these scenarios to drive checking done by tools. Now, you have to step back and say, well, what is the purpose of these tests? Well, before the software is delivered, the tests help the developer to understand his design process. But after delivery, the automated tests are an anti-regression tactic. You have to recognize what you have there. Now, the purpose of those tests, it's not the purpose of the test changes so much as you don't need as many tests, perhaps. So the tests you need to demonstrate a regression, or another way of looking at it, to demonstrate functional equivalence, that is, you haven't introduced a regression, that subset of tests is smaller than perhaps what you need when you initially build the software. So there's a process missing, which is one of culling your test packs, your test assets, to reduce it to what you actually need and to focus it on what is actually required, which is an anti-regression tactic. You could think of these tests as a tripwire. So that if for whatever reason the changes that are implemented screw up, your tripwire will trigger an alarm. The way to think of it is not, I need test automation to demonstrate full compliance with a requirement. It's to detect regression, to detect unwanted changes. That's the focus, and that is a different goal from demonstrating compliance with a requirement or a source of knowledge. Now, how do we recover from bad automation? Well, the first challenge is to take a long, hard look at what you've got. It may be that you have to scrap it all and start again. Potentially, you could salvage some of the tests that have value and scrap the rest. But you have to be cold-blooded about this and recognize what you have. It may be that the tests you have are not going to give you long-term value, but rather they will give you long-term pain. So you need to adopt a new automation approach for new, changed, and maybe high-risk features, and start small and build outwards if you like. And as you do that, assess the value of your legacy automation that is impacted by the changes and refactor those tests as you go. It's not a simple problem to solve. I haven't the time to go into all the detail of it, but you have to be very systematic about how you do this, because you have an asset which essentially you are going to repurpose, and it may be that you have to lose some, or maybe in the worst case, all of the asset you have. If you want more help on this, just Google these topics. There's anti-regression approaches, which is 4 articles I wrote a few years ago for Eurostar. And the other one is how to eliminate manual feature checking. This is a webinar I ran a month, I think maybe 6 weeks ago, which describes how you could automate manual feature checking and eliminate manual feature checking as a consequence, or the potential is there. Okay, that's really a major question, but as a tester, what areas should I be watching and researching? So what's the future? I'm just going to go through this really quickly because it's a personal view and it's what I'm looking at right now. So something I think is going to affect all our lives, both as testers, as IT professionals and society in general, is this idea of big data. There are several huge issues coming out of this for the technologists, and there's got to be a knock-on effect for us testers, because we're going to have to deal with some of these things more and more and more. A term that's being used quite a lot now is V3, the volume, velocity, variety. The volume is the quantity of data. Velocity is the rate at which new data arrives and has to be assimilated into our systems. And variety. And variety is the variety of sources. There's transaction data from existing systems. There is data from social media. There is data from sensors. There is data from weather stations and geostationary satellites and mobile devices and phones and cars and aeroplanes and God knows what. The variety of all this data means that we cannot use our traditional relational approach in our databases. And NoSQL could mean NoSQL, but it could also mean not only SQL. We have to have different technologies to support some of the things we want to do with big data. Because of the scale of it, it has to be distributed on relatively low-cost hardware. And there are products emerging. Hadoop is probably the best known, which will distribute queries across many items of low-cost hardware. Functional programming is a technical, highly technical thing, of course, but functional programming is kind of the route towards parallel processing, and I think we're going to be seeing much more parallel processing across the piece now. Redistributed testing, end of manual checking, feature checking. That's my hobby horse. Keep an eye on that. More generally, the continuous delivery, acceptance test-driven development, behavior-driven development, test-driven development, spec by example, these are all emerging, and they're kind of different flavors of similar kind of disciplines, but they're all emerging in importance and gaining momentum now. Another idea is business value testing, that is putting software into production, seeing how it performs, and then changing software to suit. So you'll hear things like continuous delivery with dark releases, A/B testing, measuring the value of software in production with instrumentation, collecting that big data, analyzing it, and then making decisions on what should happen next with your software roadmap. High volume automated testing is kind of Ken Kainer and other people's ideas of using tools in a much more systematic way than we have in the past. Just implementing manual testing is not the way forward with automation. High volume automated testing is an interesting area. I think you'll see more and more of that. Non-functional testing, every year non-functional testing becomes more important. There are huge opportunities out there, and the skills required in non-functional are in demand, and increasingly in demand. I've not mentioned the word agile. Well, you have to assume agile is everything. Everything is agile now. The whole world seems to be going in that direction, including companies that are historically not agile. I had one quick question, which is a bit of a troublesome one. I'm interested in the number of test environments used and recommended frequency of code updates to be applied. It depends. What more can I say? But let me just expand on that very, very briefly. It depends on what you want to achieve in those releases and those environments. And what are the constraints acting on you? Are you trying to do more by parallel working in many environments, or does the technology demand that you have many environments? Let me challenge you and say, well, if you want to test the updates, can't you just put them in one environment, just throw everything in and then give it a damn good thrashing? Well, not really, because you need to merge several activities, including regression testing, because change increases the risk of regression, of course. And if you want to manage regression, you need a controlled environment and you need time to execute and evaluate your tests. So the challenge really is to juggle the need to deliver, to test new stuff, to test fixes, and to regression test. So more environments isn't always a good idea. You need to orchestrate these varying activities across the team. It's not a testing problem, it's a team problem. So the team needs to figure out what it's trying to achieve. How best to pipeline changes, tests, and automated deployments. And what we're seeing now with the emergence of continuous delivery and DevOps is this notion of continuous delivery is an extreme way of solving this problem. So look that up. If you have a very complex heterogeneous environment where many test environments are required, I have to say that's a very complicated logistical problem to deal with. You have to work as a team to figure out the best way. I don't think there's a pat answer I can give, not today anyway. Why do testers get the blame? I'm going to do this rather quickly. What are you blamed for? You know, do you get blamed when you find a bug? Well, I'm sorry, I can't take that seriously. The testers do not put bugs in, they do not take bugs out. If you're getting blamed for finding bugs, you need to have sit your project manager down with your developers and say, the developers put the bugs in when they write the code. All you can do is expose them. Now, if the project manager doesn't want to see those bugs exposed, that's easily arranged, but my goodness me, you'll have problems later on. Testers get blamed for causing delay and sometimes stating the obvious and telling teams there are problems when the whole team know there's problems. And the real challenge we have is not about finding bugs. By and large, it's generally not the biggest problem to detect bugs in software. The problem is finding them early enough so they can be fixed in time. That is the problem. So the two key challenges are this: providing high-value information to stakeholders. Developers are our stakeholders, as well as business stakeholders, project managers, business analysts, developers. We need to provide that knowledge early enough for it to be acted upon. So finding bugs very late in the day is a very painful thing to do. We've got to think more about finding those problems, either preventing them or finding them earlier. Again, the Tester's Pocketbook says some things about that, so you might take a look at that. There are some references you could look at that I mentioned in passing. There's the Pocketbook, which talks about using stories to test, to validate requirements and to test software. We've got some technology that supports that, businessstory-manager.com, and there's a free version of that called sb.qa. Yes, it's a very short URL. I've been recording the content of the webinar, and we'll get it online in the next sort of 48 hours, I'm sure. And so you can see these links later on. Yep, do get in touch if you're interested. Let me move on. Okay, I'll draw it to the close. Thank you very much for your time and your questions, and we will run this session again with obviously different questions. If you've got any feedback for us, I'd be really interested to hear what you think of the slot we've done, whether this is the right thing to be doing and whether it's of value. Thanks for your attention, and I'll speak to you again soon, I hope.